And we're live. What's up, y'all? Welcome back to our Fish the Moment live stream. Today, Randy and I are going to be talking about the best early winter areas on Clearwater lakes. There's a bunch of guys already in the stream. Good to see William, Ken, Kevin, Josh, Mike, Terry, Ryan, PK, Dan, Timo, all the guys who are usually in here. Good to see everyone. Gabe, James, Table Rock Kid, John, how's it going? Great to see everyone. Randy, how you doing tonight?
Doing good, Johnny. How's it going there, man?
Oh, not too bad. Just getting ready for Thanksgiving. We're going to be cooking up a bunch of pies. That's my responsibility this year. So we're making some pecan pie, dark chocolate, and also some pumpkin pie. So I'm excited about that.
Oh, that sounds good, man. Definitely.
Awesome. Well, guys, excited to talk about these early winter areas with you today. There's a lot of misconceptions about winter bass fishing. I know some of you guys are going to be up north and won't be able to fish at all, but for those who don't have ice on the lake right now, this is one of the best times of the year to actually go and catch both quantity and quality of bass. I think a lot of guys get scared off by the cold temperatures and don't go out fishing because they think the fish are going to be really lethargic. They're going to be super deep. But a lot of times you can catch fish fishing moving baits in pretty shallow water and have a blast. So Randy's going to be covering the shallow water areas that we need to focus on these Clearwater lakes, and I'm going to be handling the offshore areas. And we're going to be going through 4 different lakes to give you guys a perspective of different lakes across the country because they don't all set up the same. But the key here is that they all have clear water. And by our definition, clear water is any time when you have more than 4 feet of water visibility. So you have 4+ feet of water visibility somewhere on the lake. That is a clear water lake in our opinion. So Randy, let's just jump into it, and if you can start sharing your screen, let's jump into Table Rock Lake and start taking a look at some good shallow water early winter spots. And while Randy's pulling that up, we'll just kind of define early winter as like that December, maybe late November through the end of December time of the year when water temperatures are still maybe in the 50s or the high 40s, and when you don't necessarily have a big chill yet. You don't have temperatures dropping into the 15 or 20 degree range like they might in January or February. The shad haven't started dying yet. Usually the shad start dying around 45-degree water temperature. So I think about the early winter time, anytime you're fishing when there's not super cold temperatures. Now again, some parts of the country you may never get water temperatures below 50 degrees, and so you're kind of in that early winter / late winter period of the year the entire time. I don't know if I've been saying late winter, Randy. I meant early winter, but
Yeah.
early winter. And so in that early winter is like December, anytime the water temperature is like 48 degrees and above. So looks like you got it pulled up here now. Let's jump in and talk about Table Rock.
Yeah. First of all, I think that a lot of people, when you talk about early winter fishing, that's really relative to just like you're talking about, Johnny, it's really relative to the part of the country that you're in. And it's also unique to the specific lake you're on because every single lake it's got a unique characteristic about itself that can be duplicated on different lakes, but a lot of times it's just completely unique. For example, like Johnny and I were talking before we got on the podcast tonight about the similarities between Lake Lanier in Georgia and like Table Rock Lake or like a Bull Shoals Lake here in the Ozarks. And while you do have a lot of similarities in those lakes as far as water clarity, some parts of the lake have the same type of bank angles. The fish still act different. They position different. They use different type of banks and different type of structures within the same time of the year. And a lot of that has to do with the combination of water clarity, the water, the type of banks that fall off as far as the rock that's on the bank, and just basically the geographical setup of the body of water that you're on. So anyway, we'll start out. We're going to cover those. Let's start out a little bit here with Table Rock. First of all, I sort of classify early winter is when you start. It's a gradual process. It's something like all of a sudden you just don't wake up one day and it's early winter or it's fall. The progression from late fall into early winter is something that's really subtle. It's really slow, and a lot of times you can't really identify it. It happens so slow. But for me, one of the things that I notice is when you start having those first 2 or 3 really cold snaps where it's starting to get down like abnormally cold. Like, for example, here in Missouri, you might have a couple nights where it gets down into 25 degrees and it only warms up to a high of 40 in the daytime. And it really begins cooling off that surface temperature throughout the lake. And one of the things you have to realize about early winter fishing when you're gauging water temperature is the water temperature you want to go by is what the water temperature is on the main lake at the very warmest part of the day, because you sort of get a fake water temperature. If you take the water temperature like back in the cove or somewhere right off the bat in the morning, that's going to give you a false water temperature just because of the night. So the true water temperature is like, something that you see on the main lake during 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So when that first starts to happen in this part of the country and through the same um, geographical uh, areas going east, like if you go from Table Rock east, through some of the Tennessee lakes, Kentucky lakes, into Lake Norman, sort of that same geographical area, we're starting to get now into water temperatures that are sort of like in the upper 50s, which in December, that's really warm. But we've seen a trend, weather patterns, climate change, all that type of stuff. We've seen a trend where water temperatures are simply not as cold in December as they were 30 or 40 years ago. I've seen it myself. So there's almost like a new norm that has been established. But anyway, and the fish are going to react and adjust to that differently. So basically, like right now, we're talking about water temperatures in the maybe mid upper 50s, that type of stuff, which is sort of signaling the early winter transition. And what you have in that is, say for example, we'll go to Indian Creek here on Table Rock, and this is the mid. This right here is sort of the mid part of the creek, as you can tell, pretty much mid part of it. And in on Table Rock or any Ozark Lake or even any other type of lakes, for example, when you're in these larger creeks off of the main lake, these bass will live in here all year long. A lot of people they tend to think that bass move back in the creeks in the fall and they start moving out to the main lake in the winter. And yeah, there's a percentage of the population of bass that do that, but they're also a segment of the population of bass that live in these creeks all winter long, especially early in the winter, like right now. So one of the first things that I like to do is these secondary points on the major creeks are highways for the bass. And bass live on these secondary points all year long. They'll spawn on them. They live out deep in the summer, in the winter, the fall, whatever. In the fall time of the year, they're very weather oriented. They'll get up shallow on these points on cloudy, windy days. They'll move out deeper and suspend. But this time of the year in early winter, this is one of the first areas that I like to check. And normally this gets better in clear water lakes where you have water visibility once that water temperature starts to get down in that 50-degree range or even below 50-degree range. Until then, these secondary points are real situational. Even in the early winter, they're really dependent upon weather. And a lot of people they say, well, like in cold winter, cold water, you want sunny days so it'll warm the water up. That's not necessarily the case. When you've got water temperatures anytime in the 50s, 50 degrees up to 60 degrees, these bass on these secondary points in these clear water creeks get real active shallow. I'm talking like right here, anywhere between 5 to 10 feet deep. And they get active with the wind, they get active with the cloud conditions, and you can catch them really shallow, even when the water temperature is 50 degrees. Now, these same bass may move deeper out on these points on a calm, sunny day, even though the water temperature is the same. They'll maybe use that 15 to 20 foot zone on the bottom. Some of them will be out here in that 30 to 40 foot or even deeper, suspended out over the timber tops. That's the first thing I look for. But one of the things I'm really paying close attention to in the early winter is like this right here. This is like just a main creek bank. It's pretty uniform through it. This particular area here, it's chunk rock, steeper bank, fairly quick drop offs, timber out here in 40 or 50 feet of water. And in the early winter, this is one of my favorite times to get on these 45-degree angle chunk rock banks and just cover water. And I'm not really focusing on the points. I'm not back in the coves. These main body chunk rock banks in the creeks, you'll get a lot of crawdad feeders. And this is one of my favorite time of year when that water temperature first starts to get down in the mid 50s. I like to cover a lot of water on these 45-degree angle banks with like a crawdad crankbait. A lot of people associate a crawdad crankbait like with pre-spawn, but that's not the case. They eat it really good in the early winter time. So I'll go back in these major creeks and I'll just start fishing these steeper banks like this, usually down from the secondary points. And it's really been a really good pattern for me as far as this time of year. So those 45-degree angle banks, secondary points, key winter areas.
Now, Randy, when you're going to this creek, obviously you're picking out creek banks you've caught them on before in Indian Creek, but there are literally thousands of banks that look identical and thousands of points that look identical to these points in this creek. So how do you narrow it down from one secondary point to another when you're out on the lake?
Well, a lot of it is, and obviously it's changing now, with the whole live scope technology, that's going to make it a lot easier. But, the way that I like to do it is, it doesn't take long. Say, for example, in this little arm right here, this, major arm right off the main part of the creek, I may roll in here and I may make 15 or 20 casts on this main lake point. I may or may not catch one, and then I'll start working my way back in the creek and I'll start fishing these more subtle rounded points like this. You don't even really call them points. They're more just like roll offs like that. But these fish, like even this little bitty one right here, these bass in the early winter time, they really like to set up on these little tiny subtle rounded points back in the coves further. And it doesn't take long. So say, for example, it's 10 o'clock in the morning. I roll in, I hit this point right here. Takes me 5 minutes to hit it. I'll roll in here and I'll hit all this stuff like this, even all the way back in there. All these, sometimes like this area right here, sometimes these last little secondary points in the backs of the coves and creeks like this are really good in the early winter time, as long as that water temperature is above 50 degrees. So I can start on this point right here, and I can hit this point and 4 or 5 other points in this area here in 30 minutes. So I can cover a tremendous amount of water. Say, for example, I roll in here and I catch one here, or I catch one right there, or one right there. Then I can start patterning the lake based upon the position of these secondary coves within the creeks. And sometimes, I may stay off these main points like this, and I just run straight to the back of the coves. Anything like this. See this little cove here with this little secondary rounded point on it? This is prime early winter type cover on any Clearwater lake like that. And, just because it's back in a cove doesn't mean it's not productive, as long as you've got, 15 plus feet of water off the ends of them.
Awesome. That's some good stuff there. So let me switch over here, Andy, and while if you could, I'm just going to pull up my screen, my Navionics. While I'm doing that, could you pull up Lake Hartwell so that you're ready to go on that? Now I'm going to pull up Table Rock here for you guys as well. Now I'm going to cover some offshore stuff because Randy, obviously shallow water expert, was fishing over here in Indian Creek on all these secondary points. And that's kind of his key go-to with crankbaits, jerkbaits. Well, I like to fish offshore, and I don't really like to go do the jerkbait, crankbait deal that much if I can avoid it in the winter, because that's what everyone is doing in my area. There's a lot of guys that fish that, like Randy, and so I need to find something that's different that goes my strength, the offshore fishing. Now, one mistake I used to make a lot when I was fishing offshore in the winter, or trying to fish offshore in the winter, is I would look for the fish in the same areas that they would set up in the summertime. So, for example, if we go over to the mouth of this creek right here, one of my favorite summertime areas on Table Rock is this point that runs out here. We have a really nice creek channel that's 200 feet deep, coming up to a long, wide point that's in 15 to 25 feet of water. And you can see there's a really sharp creek channel drop, and there's a lot of water to cover here. This is where I like to fish in the summer, even in the post-spawn, and even in the early fall. But what I find is that these areas are not very effective in the winter time when you're trying to fish offshore, especially when you're fishing on clear water lakes. Instead, what I find is that these fish will actually not relate to structure very well. They don't relate to points. They don't relate to the creek channels as much. What they're focused on is bait fish. Bait fish is the number one key when you're trying to locate offshore bass on Clearwater lakes in the wintertime. And what happens is that a lot of the bait fish in the summer, in the post-spawn, in the fall, will be positioning somewhat close to a creek channel and a structure spot, like a point or a hump or some sort of ledge. But as you get into that early winter, especially as you get into the midwinter period, a lot of those bait fish are going to pull out into the middle of these deeper channels and drains and guts. You probably have heard all those terms used before. A drain, a ditch, a channel, a gut. There's all these different names for it. At the end of the day, all it is basically a place where an old river channel is cutting into the bank and forming a creek. So you have a creek here, creek here, creek here. And what will happen is that these bait fish, instead of setting up on a point here or a point here or even like around this point, are just going to be sitting out over here, over 100 foot of water, 200 feet of water sometimes, feeding on bait fish. And what you'll find is that the bait fish are actually going to be suspended in anywhere from 30 to 90 feet of water, and bass will be positioning around them out here in the middle of these bays, in the middle of these drains. And it's really crazy because I catch fish on Table Rock really deep, and actually I've heard some guys catching them as deep as 90 feet of water, catching bass in 90 feet of water in the center of guts and ditches just like this. And they're doing it right now. And I do this also all winter long. And what you'll find is that all you need to do basically is graph in the middle of these drains, in the middle of these creeks, and you'll find the bait fish positioned out here over, again, 100 foot of water, suspended 30 to 90 feet down. And what I'll do is I'll look for schools of bass on my fish finder that are positioned around those bait fish, and then I'll take a really heavy spoon. So the bait I would be throwing, just pull this up here real quick, is going to be like the Jewel Scuba Spoon. And this is a really heavy, spelled scuba wrong, is a really heavy 1 ounce metal jigging spoon. And this is the deal when you're fishing vertically for these fish. You can also catch them on an ice fishing jig or a poly jigging wrap, a Demiki rig. There's a lot of baits that you can fish vertically on these fish. And I'll be making a bunch of videos about this in the next upcoming weeks. But the key is getting a heavy bait that you can drop straight down to those fish very quickly, because I'm using my electronics to actually look for these fish. I'm going to be using my 2D sonar and my live scope to fish vertically for these fish. And all these fish, again, are going to be in these guts, and they're going to be roaming and moving a lot because those bait fish are going to kind of be swimming up and down these drains. You'll find that maybe earlier in the morning, they'll usually be pushed a little bit further back in the creeks, and then later in the day, they're going to be pushed out more towards the main lake. You'll also find that when you have really strong current, those bait fish will get sucked out to the main part of the lake, and they're going to disperse. They're going to spread out more when there's a lot of current. When there's less current, you'll find that they push deeper into the creeks, and they're going to be more grouped up, and that usually makes them easier to catch. The toughest situation, honestly, is when you have a lot of current and those bait fish are really spread apart, and a lot of times it's even hard to get bit at all fishing in these offshore areas, these guts and these drains. So if I find that most of the shad are on the main lake and there's a lot of current, that's when I'll actually switch up and try to go fish up shallow like what Randy's doing, instead of trying to catch those isolated, spread out fish. And the key to the creeks I'm looking for are that I don't want a creek that's as narrow and finger-like as the one that Randy picked out here. Randy picked out a very narrow finger-like creek. And the reason this is great for Randy is because these fish basically are going to use these secondary points as their feeding ground to ambush bait fish. And they can move out of this 90 to 100 foot of water and quickly move up into the shallower water around these points. And this quick transition from shallow to deep water is really good for the bait fish to feed and the bass to feed as well. But if you're looking for offshore fish, you need to find areas where you have a much more gradual slope to the bank, and it needs to be a wider pocket. So for example, like this area here, where you have not as many secondary points, there's not a lot of places that would look good for shallow fishing, and that will push those bait fish out really deep in the middle of the water column, out here just suspended in the middle of these drains and guts. And basically what I'll do is just get to the lake and I'll just graph through the center of as many of these drains and many of these guts as I can until I find the fish. I figure out how deep they're in. Once I find the depth of those bait fish are in, I'm going to drop my spoon or an Alabama rig or a Damiki rig or whatever I'm fishing down into those areas, and I'm just going to find a bunch of fish offshore in these type of areas all winter long. This is not just a early winter, this is an all winter deal offshore. So that's how I do it, Randy. How does that sound to you?
That sounds a lot more complicated than just going down the bank with a crankbait to me.
Well,
But you know that is just it's fascinating because I that just goes to show you how much how diverse that and how adaptable that a bass is. I mean, you take for example, when Cody Huff won at Table Rock, like you were talking about catching bass 90 foot deep a couple weeks ago at Table Rock Lake. Also, I think the guy that got second place in the tournament caught him like on a spinnerbait or a square bill up the river. So you got both of this stuff going on that is equally competitive. But I think that if you can get them like the way Johnny's talking about, deep suspended like that, you're just dealing with so many more fish than just the isolated individual rogue fish that I'm after.
yeah, and I've had days on Table Rock in the winter where I catch 50 to 120 bass a day, where I'm absolutely just bringing them in the boat. And you get a lot of 2.5 to 3 pounders doing it too throughout the day, smallmouth, largemouth, everything. But Randy, you actually have usually a better chance to catch the bigger fish, the 4 and 5 pounders. I don't get a lot of 4 and 5 pounders out there offshore. And someone asks here, will the bass stay on those 45-degree angled banks all winter? Yes, they will. Even when the water temperature is like 42 degrees, they'll stay on those 45-degree banks, and they'll be pretty shallow. They'll be in less than 15 foot of water all winter long. There's two kind of populations of fish in the wintertime. There's a group that stays less than 15 feet year-round all winter, and there's a group that's out there in 60 to 80 feet of water. And you can target both of them. Both are effective techniques. It's just which one suits you better.
Yeah, and it's just like, like Johnny says a lot, and like, we've been fishing a lot together this past 4 or 5 months. And it's like, Johnny spends so much time hunting for these fish with his electronics. And I'm fishing the whole time trying to catch fish. But once he gets on them and once he finds those fish, that's when he can make up that ground. I mean, I've got to be consistent throughout the day, catch them all day long. And that's why Johnny, if he hasn't caught a fish at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, he doesn't lose confidence because once he finds them, it's boom, 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 boom. So, there's advantages and disadvantages to both techniques.
100%. Yeah, it's not an easy way to fish for the offshore deal, especially in the winter because you're driving a lot to find those bait fish and stuff. But once you find them, you can catch more offshore fish in the winter than any other time of the year. They group up so tight and get really tight to those bait fish schools. And if you know how to pick them off, which again, we're making a lot of videos about that here over the next few months, it can get crazy. So what would you do then on a Lake Hartwell, Randy? So we're talking about Table Rock there first. Let's switch over to Lake Hartwell. Okay. This is a blueback heron lake, and that's going to throw some curveballs in there, at least for the offshore bite. And it's also, again, a similarly Clearwater Lake on the East Coast.
Yeah, here's what we're talking about as far as each lake is unique to itself. And while Hartwell has some similarities to Table Rock, it's extremely different because, like I said, Table Rock Lake, you've got a threadfin and a gizzard shad base. Lake Hartwell, those fish, there are threadfin shad in it, but they feed super heavily on those blueback herring. And if you've never fished a blueback herring lake, it is completely different because these bass, the spotted bass and the largemouth bass on a blueback herring lake, they act like striped bass. They roam out off the bank over nothing, just chasing these herring all the time. They're not setting up on cover. They're not positioning. They're just roamers like that. So, and not all of them are like that, but some of them. But here's what we have at Hartwell. It's from my perspective, from the shallow water perspective. You've got two different areas as far as I'm concerned that you need to focus on. One would be the upper river portion of Lake Hartwell, and I'll explain why here in a second. And then I'll scroll out and I'm going to show you the down the lake here. Now, down the lake here on Lake Hartwell, if you've ever, I'm sure there's a lot of people listening that fished Hartwell before, so they know what I'm talking about. This is the key juice on Lake Hartwell, the lower end of it. I mean, you've got the Gumlog Creek here where there's a ton of tournaments won. Then this whole lower end is this is one of the most complex lakes I've ever fished as far as the type of bank and offshore structure. So you can see out here, there's just tons of islands, all this type of stuff. And in the wintertime, in the early winter out here, um, this is real situational to the weather because when you're talking shallow fish, now Jonny can go over these deep suspended cane pile, offshore lead shoal fish. But what I'm talking about when I'm fishing the lower end of the lake like Hartwell in the early winter time, I'm going back in the back of these coves off the main lake. And like Jonny talked about earlier about getting in the guts, in the early winter time, these shallow coves like this that may be 15 or 20 foot of water, these real, just the stuff like this, not real deep. These fish will set up in the middle of this stuff in the early winter out here, and they'll get in anywhere between, 5 to 20 foot of water. On a cloudy, windy day, you might be able to run like way back in the 5 to 7 foot zone and toss a lipless crankbait or a jerkbait straight down the middle of it and catch them. On some days, they may be a little bit farther out, like in the 15 to 25 foot zone, and you can catch them like just reeling a swim bait or even underspin, something like that. Real situational on the weather. Also, you've got some dock fish that can be caught in the backs end of these. Some of the deeper dock ends with brush on them in the early winter are going to be good. But in the early winter, like I said, you're still talking water temperatures in the 50s. So these fish have not really, they're still shallow. I mean, when the water temperatures are in the shallow, even in clear water lakes, they're gonna bite shallow. But if you're fishing like on Lake Hartwell on the lower end of the lake, shallow, it's very weather dependent. You want those days that are windy, you want those days that are cloudy, nasty, rainy days. That's going to be some really good fishing days. Also, if you're fishing the lower end of the lake in the clear water like this, um, these little rounded, gravelly secondary points can be real good on those nasty days. Burning a spinner bait over the top of them, maybe possibly even the top water if the water temperature is in the 50 degrees, shallow crankbait, whatever, those fish will get real shallow on it. But that's a real hit and miss deal. The more, in my opinion, the more consistent bite on a blueback herring lake, if you want to fish shallow in the winter, in the early winter, we're talking about water temperatures still, above 50 degrees, this is when I go up the river sections of it. And I'm not in this particular section here. This is a really good part of Lake Hartwell because you have a lot of intersections of feeder creeks in this particular part of the lake up here. And in the early winter time, in the fall time of the year, I really like to go back into these creeks. And I'm fishing way back in the creeks, fishing the docks, isolated wood, whatever visible shoreline cover is, maybe some secondary points. But what I like to do in the early winter is that water temperature starts to get closer down to that 50-degree mark. I move out to the main lake, close to the creek's arms here, and I'm fishing the main lake itself. These main lake structures, these steeper banks on the main lake like this. These are sort of short, bluffy, steep banks. You can see by the contours here, and then you got a lot of little main points all along the main part of the lake here. Stuff like this, these subtle points, rounded points like this. The thing about this, these fish will use these little subtle secondary point, not secondary, but subtle main river points up here, shallower than they do down the lake because your water visibility is like half what it is down by the dam. Water visibilities in this part of like Lake Hartwell, you're talking about sort of maybe in that 3 foot range, depending upon the type of weather and runoff and rain you've had recently, versus that 8 to 10 foot visibility down the lake. So one of my favorite techniques in the early winter on a lake like Lake Hartwell, Lake Lanier, Russell Lake, any of those blueback herring lakes, is I go up the river till I start to see a water clarity change, and I start fishing these basically the main lake points up the river with like jerk baits, crank baits, smaller swim baits, that type of stuff. Obviously, Alabama rig would be real good if you're not fishing in a tournament. But these fish will use the bottom on these type of points, and they'll also suspend out here at the same time. So you're going to have two different populations of fish. You're going to have those fish that are living in 5 foot of water or so, and then the ones that are suspended 5 to 10 feet deep over like the 10 to 30 foot zone. And every one of these points, when you go up here on a lake like Hartwell and you're on the main part of the lake, I mean, some of the points, depending upon the side of the lake you're on, are going to be steeper than others. I mean, you're going to have some real flat points, and you're going to have some steeper points. Usually, based upon how the lake's turning up through, when you're running up there, you'll have a steep side on one side, channel-oriented side like you have here, and then across the lake you'll have a flatter side. And either point can be good. You could catch them on these channel swing points, or they could be on the flatter side. It's a matter of just running them. So what I like to do is I'll get into an area that I like the looks of it, and I just start hitting every single point that I come to up the lake. And you'll know within a couple of hours if it's going to be productive or not. A lot of times it's a matter of just figuring out the right bait they want. Lipless crankbait sometimes, like I said, jerk bait, swim bait. Sometimes they want something slow like a swing head jig or a football head jig, shallower like that 5 to 10 foot zone. But overall, in the early winter time, blueback herring lake, I'm up the river until that water temperature gets below 50 degrees. You there, Johnny?
Sorry, Randy, I was talking. I had my mic muted so people didn't hear me typing. So yeah, that's awesome. As you can see, there's a lot of good options in this early winter, and those same patterns work throughout the entire winter time. So this isn't just specific to the early winter a lot. And as you can see, you have the shallow water patterns, you have the kind of deeper-ish water down by the dam, and then I'm going to talk about the offshore stuff. There's so many options in the winter, and I think a lot of you guys think the fishing is just awful in the winter overall, but I find that it's some of the best fishing of the year if you know what to look for. So cool. Well, one thing I want to share with you guys really quick before I jump into, there's a couple of questions I want to answer, and I also want to show you a few things on fishthemoment.com that we just added that we're really excited about. One thing we really want to talk about are our Fish the Moment lake breakdowns. We've been spending a ton of time redoing these breakdowns to provide 40 GPS coordinates on lakes all across the country with detailed area descriptions and lake summaries. Randy makes all of these lake breakdowns, and you can actually download these waypoints straight onto a fish finder, Garmin, Humminbird, Lowrance, and we give step-by-step instructions on how to do this. And we also have the ability to open them up in Google Earth as well, so you can view them there. And Randy has been going crazy. If you take a look, we have a bunch of winter breakdowns that just popped up this week. All these breakdowns take Randy 4 or 5 hours to make, so he's been grinding really hard, and it's been awesome to get these fall breakdowns up for a lot of these lakes, and then more winter breakdowns. And I know a lot of guys have been asking about personal lake breakdowns, where we actually break down lakes that aren't available on the website. And once Randy's done with the opens, then he will be starting those personal lake breakdowns. He'll be able to do 4 a week. So once he gets back from his last open, we're going to offer that on the website as we did before. Another thing to just mention is that we have our upcoming virtual seminars, one on offshore winter bass fishing. I'm talking a little bit about offshore winter fishing in this live stream, but I'm not going near into the depth that I would in this seminar. I'm going to include sonar recordings, Navionics maps, explain bass fishing migration offshore, our offshore bass fishing migration, as well as all different baits, techniques, retrieves, all those things to catch literally 50 to 100 offshore bass almost every trip you go if you follow what I talk about in the seminar. It's an awesome one, so definitely check that out. And then Randy and I will also be doing an advanced winter crankbait fishing seminar for those who are wanting to fish up shallow. I love fishing crankbaits in the winter, even though I love offshore fishing even a little bit more. And that's going to be on December 17th. And December 3rd is the winter or the offshore winter seminar next week. So definitely check these out if you haven't already. And we've also offered a recording of my advanced electronics seminar that's been super popular, and I've done 4 of them now, and I feel like most of the people who want to do it have probably signed up, but we are offering this seminar for sale. So if you want to check this out, you can, if you couldn't make them before because of a conflict or whatever, you can purchase the recording. It's a 3-hour seminar with awesome information on all of the nitty-gritty aspects of electronics and how to apply it to catch a bunch more fish. Last thing we want to talk about really fast is that we are doing a merchandise holiday sale all the way through Christmas. So 25% off on all merchandise. We have the Fish the Moment OG hat for those of you who have been with the channel for a really long time. We have the OG shirt. We have the Performance Sun shirt, which is a really good price now. You can't beat that $40 for a really nice sun shirt. The buff, as well as some gift cards if you want to have your family maybe get you a gift card so you can purchase some of this stuff. It's a great stocking stuffer, a great gift for yourself. So just a few things we have on the website. And then one more thing, I know I'm talking about a bunch of stuff, but we recently got back in stock on the Fish the Moment Offshore Jig by Jewel Bait Company. I know I've talked a lot about this bait in videos, and we were out of stock for like 3 months because of skirt supply. It was kind of a nightmare getting stuff from overseas for all fishing lure manufacturers. But now that we're back in stock on skirts, we have plenty of inventory, and these jigs are amazing. They come through cover super well, and for $6.99 you get 2 jigs. It's a 2-pack of a 5/8 ounce jig, so you're basically getting $3 a jig. High quality components, super high quality skirt that you can't find at any other jig in the market. Definitely check out this jig if you're wanting to catch some fish offshore any time of the year, and I'm going to be throwing a lot this winter as well. So that is all of the announcements. So let's jump back over to Hartwell and talk about some offshore areas. So one thing that we did get a question on. We have actually got a couple questions. One was from Men73, who asked about the depth of water I mentioned on Table Rock, how I was catching fish on 90 feet of water. And he said, usually you hear about the thermocline, and the thermocline means that there's going to be a certain portion of the water column where the oxygen is so low the fish can't survive. And this is kind of an illustration here of the thermocline that I'm going to throw on the screen here for you guys. This is kind of just a basic illustration of what the thermocline is. And basically what you have is a phenomenon where you have warm, oxygenated water on top of the water column and cooler, less oxygenated water on the bottom of the lake. And this creates a band of water called the thermocline, where these two water columns, or these two types of water meet, and all the water below the thermocline is basically unlivable for bait fish and bass. But the thermocline only exists when water temperatures are pretty warm, like above 70, maybe 75 degrees. When that water temperature starts dropping in the 60s and the 50s, the thermocline actually disappears, and this is what is called the fall turnover. And because that thermocline disappears, those fish can now live as deep as 100 feet of water. There's nothing holding them back from going super deep. And on very clear lakes, those fish and the bait fish can go 80, 90 feet deep, and that's where a lot of the bass will go to chase them. So you can fish super deep water in the winter. Don't be afraid to go down to that 90 foot of water range. You can still catch them down there. And then one other question we had was Michael says, are you graphing 45 degree banks first, looking for shad cover? No shad means don't fish the bank. Do you do any graphing on your banks, Randy, before you fish them, or you just kind of pull up and just start fishing them?
No, I keep an eye out on my electronics as I'm fishing, and, if I see something great, but I usually don't go in there and graph them first. I'm paying more attention to the depth off of the bank and just the type of, bank structure that there are in the visible cover.
Got it. Yeah, and I don't usually graph down banks too much. I just find that it's easier just to fish down them and see if they're in that area. I graph if they're more offshore. It's maybe a little bit better. Do it that way. But yeah, so Lake Hartwell. So Randy mentioned that he was fishing on the lower end, doing some stuff in the middle of the guts, and also fishing boat docks with brush piles around them, or then up the river arms. Well, I kind of take a similar approach to the first technique Randy does, where he said he was going, in the back of these pockets, and he was finding where the shad and the bass would be pushed up in the backs of shallow pockets. But instead of fishing in the middle of these guts and drains, let's say 20 to 30 feet of water, I'm fishing much deeper. And I'm actually out here out in front of these guts and drains, fishing for bass that are suspended again over 50 to 80 feet of water. Now, I just want to show you a couple spots where guys have caught them really well in Bassmaster Classics, actually, on Lake Hartwell in the wintertime. And these are just areas that are known great areas. One of them is this pocket right here where Casey Ashley caught some of his fish during the Bassmaster Classic in 2015 when he won that event. And basically what you have here is you have a main creek channel that runs right here and a secondary creek channel that splits off into this pocket. And what you'll find is that the middle of this creek channel is 60 feet deep. And what will happen is that in the mornings on a lot of these lakes that have blueback herring in them, the blueback herring will push shallow. They'll actually push all the way in the back of these pockets and cuts. And a lot of guys were catching fish on underspins and jerk baits, like Randy was talking about, in the middle of these creeks, just fishing in the dead middle of the creek. But then as the day progresses and you get the sun peeking out after the first hour of the morning and the low light conditions disappear, those blueback herring will move out of the creeks and get to the mouths of these pockets. They actually make a pretty big move in and out throughout the day. They'll swim more than like your traditional threadfin shad. So basically what you'll find is that these fish are going to be positioned wherever those blueback herring are. So if the herring are out here in the mouth of this gut, here in the mouth of this creek, that's where the bass will be. If the herring are back here in the middle of the gut in the back of this creek, that's where the bass will be. And what Casey was doing is he was throwing an underspin with a fluke as well as a football jig, dragging it on the edge of these rounded points in very deep water, 35 to 45 feet of water. What would happen is that these bass would be positioning on the edge of these points, right on the very tip of these points, right before they drop off in the center of that gut. And those herring, every once in a while, would move up out of the middle of that gut, up into that shallower water to feed on standing timber and rock piles and things like that. And he would be able to position his boat and just make repeated casts on these different points over and over again to get bit. Another area that Casey was catching them was up in this area, and he was fishing these, actually it was right in here, this drain right here. Again, those fish would push further back into these drains in the mornings, chasing the herring in 20 to 25 feet of water. And then as they progressed, they moved further out here towards the middle of the lake, and they would be in this gut in 60 to 70 feet of water, and he was catching them off points like here and over here and over here. But again, the fish were positioning in 25 to 40 feet of water, and he was actually fishing his underspin and his football jigs on the bottom really slow, just crawling them up there. And whenever he would get around the bass, usually he would get bit if the blueback herring were in this section of the gut at that time. If the blueback herring were back in here, though, he wouldn't get bit. So it's all about that herring movement. If you're not where the herring are in these guts, you're not going to be catching them. And there's a lot of areas like this around the lake, and so finding these special little guts and drains is very difficult, because if you scroll into every single pocket, there's a gut in every 20 feet you go. So the key is not only do you have to find out if the gut is effective by graphing it beforehand, finding the herring on your graph, but then once you do, you have to determine what the movement is throughout the day based on the sunlight, the wind, the cloud cover, the sun, stuff like that, of where those bass will position based on different conditions. So this is going to be kind of a key deal on Hartwell, and that's how I would be fishing usually on these lakes this time of year. The only exception to that would be maybe fishing some offshore brush piles. As you get into this like fall to early winter transition, some really good areas are places where, let me find a good example of this. Let's see here. Here we go. So, for example, this is an area where Brett Ayler was fishing during one of the Bassmaster Classics, and there's a little point right here, and there's a deep creek channel in 100 feet of water, and there was a cane pile or a brush pile right here off the tip of this point, right next to that creek channel. And in that early winter and the late winter time, some of these bass will position on brush piles right on the edge of that creek channel, almost on like a channel drop. And this is where a lot of spotted bass will stack up. And you can catch some fish throughout the day that will pull up out of deep water, get in those cane piles to chase heron, and the heron will actually be feeding on those cane piles as well. So that's another little deal. You can kind of just run all these little points where the creek channel swings in tight and there's a cane pile up on top. So that is kind of the approach I would take if I was fishing on Lake Hartwell, if I was doing offshore fishing. Now, a couple questions that we have here. One question is from Jay Power. He asks, does the winter strategy change for lakes that only average 40 feet deep and are stained? 100%. And we're actually going to be making another stream talking about stained and dirty water lakes in the early and during the winter time, in the early winter and during the winter, because the way that you fish on Lake Hartwell, on Table Rock, and the two lakes we're going to talk about after this is completely different than how we would fish if we were on a stained, dirty water lake. So if your lake is very muddy, let's say less than 3 foot of visibility, less than 4 foot of visibility, and the average depth is less than 50 feet of water, the tactics we're talking about here are not going to work. So don't try to go do these tactics if you are on a lake that doesn't set up like these. We're talking specifically clear water lakes, 4+ feet of visibility. So, Randy, next up we're going to be talking about Lake Washita in Arkansas. So if you could pull that up, that's where we're going next. And the reason we're going to Washita, guys, is that we want to give you guys a perspective on a lake that has grass. Some winter lakes have aquatic vegetation that's submerged. So you might have milfoil or hydrilla grass that grows in the lake, and you still have clear water. And that's the case on Washita. And that makes it a completely different animal than other lakes across the country. Because that hydrilla is in the lake, it will hold those fish shallower throughout the winter, and they'll be setting up in that hydrilla for the entire summer, the entire winter, and that's where they key a lot of times is in that hydrilla. So, Randy, let me toss this over to your screen really quick. Let's see here. Give me 1 second, guys. I'm trying to get this pulled up. There we go. So let's pull up Lake Washita, Randy, and talk about some shallow areas you'd fish there.
Yeah, like I said, the grass, when you're talking about a lake like Washita and the hydrilla that's there, that's a real it's a real iffy thing, because grass, like I said, the density and the location of grass changes seasonally. It changes a lot year to year, and based upon different environmental conditions, it can show up one year in one area and be gone the next. So when you're talking about grass lakes like that, a lot of it is you have to hunt that stuff when you're there at the specific time. But I don't really consider the grass a grass pattern like on a lake like Washita being a shallow water pattern. I mean, for me, when I'm fishing a lake like Washita, and I used to fish down there quite a bit in the cold water back when I was fishing, when I started out fishing like a lot of the old, they were red man tournaments back then. They're called BFLs now, but we fished Washita, quite a bit during the cold weather months. And for me, the big key on Washita during the early winter is it doesn't really set up like Table Rock does, even though it's similar. The thing that I'm looking for Washita is I love fishing around these shallow islands on the lake. In the midsection of the lake, pull this up again, the midsection of Washita, particularly around the main marina. What's the name of that marina, Johnny? Do you remember the main marina here?
The Mountain Harbor or Crystal Springs?
Yeah, Mountain Harbor, the Mountain Harbor area there, the mid part of the lake I do really good getting on these, basically these mid-river islands on here and getting on the steeper banks like this. Like, anytime you got a steeper section, close to tighter contours off an island like this. And this is when early in the winter time, you can catch them really good on a jerk bait shallow. Basically positioning your boat at a 45-degree angle, cast into the bank. A lot of these fish are going to come out of like 5 to 10 feet of water on the jerk bait. And both, largemouth and spotted bass, both, I'm not really fishing any of the flatter stuff like this. I'm just going down these islands, whether they be visible islands, offshore islands, in places like this right here, tight contours. And you don't really have to be point oriented. It's not like these fish are going to set up on the main point. You can get just straight down the steeper portions of it as well. And there's quite a few of them in here, even the smaller ones like this. You see all these islands into here? every one of these islands like this, there's going to, like this particular one here, there's going to be one section, a sweet spot of the island, just like right here, where you got a little bit tighter depth contours. And when that water temperature starts to get down close to 50, like I said, there's a lot of those fish will suspend, shallower on those steeper contours. That's the first thing that I look for. Second thing that I'm going to look for in lake like Washita again is I'm going to come out over here and hit up the river arm a little bit more. If you notice here on Lake Washita, you can see once you get up in this particular part of the river here, you've got some steeper bluffy banks here. You've got the flats over on this side. But notice the transition about how the lake lays from like this portion of the lake right here to like this portion of the lake right here. This is like the first area of the lake on the rivers, and the other rivers the same way too, that starts to get a little bit steeper right here. You can see the contours, get a little tighter. Let me scroll out a little bit more. And I'll come out again here to these steeper channel banks on the river part. And just like I was saying at Table Rock, I'll get on these banks right here and just cover water, steep banks, crawfish crankbait, just get on it and just cover as much as water as I can, just concentrating on there may be isolated rock piles, there may be some irregular features along here, there may be some isolated wood laydowns around here, picking apart whatever is available shallow. And to scroll out a little bit more, you can sort of see what I'm talking about here again, how the unique part of it, there's always portions of a river section that change and get hot. For example, like this back in here, this was good like in fall time of the year, mid-fall, early fall, mid-fall, the flats here, isolated wood on the flats. And as it gets early winter, they start to move out a little bit on the steeper stuff here, even in these steeper coves. And then gradually by the dead of the winter, they're farther out in the creek here. So two things on Lake Washita that I would suggest on a lake like that, fish those islands, fish the tight contours, run up the river to the first main steeper sections of bank, crank that steep rock, fish a jig on it, fishing tight to the bank. You're not really fishing anything over 10 foot deep, and sort of fishing it like you do pre-spawn. There's a lot of similarities on Clearwater lakes between the early winter and the late pre-spawn period. A lot of those fish set up and they get on the same type of cover. The difference is in shallow water fishing in the early winter versus the pre-spawn is the size of the fish. The size of the fish that are up on the bank in the early winter tend to be a lot smaller than they are in the pre-spawn. When that water temperature in the pre-spawn starts to get up into the mid to upper 50s, that has been down in the 40s and 50s, that's when the biggest fish in the lake get shallow on these same type of areas. They get on the same type of stuff here. But in the early winter time, what you're talking about, a lot of times these are smaller fish. They're keepers. I mean, you can catch an occasional good one, but you don't have those large numbers of those 3 to 5 pound bass using the same type of cover as you do in the pre-spawn, even though they're using the same type of cover.
Got it. Randy, I hate to break it to you, but I would kick your butt on Washita. You went to the wrong end of the lake, buddy. I fished Washita a lot over the years, so I know Washita really well. What you mentioned there, Randy, is interesting because all of that definitely is the case with the section lake that you're on there. The Irons Fork area has very little to no vegetation, and so it's a lot of grass, a lot of timber. And so what Randy talked about is 100% accurate on that part of the lake. Unfortunately, for Randy, if he's fishing against me, I would be going to the completely other end of the lake. So Randy was over here in the Irons Fork, North Fork area of this is Iron Fork area of Washita. I would be over here in Blakely Creek as well as in Rabbit and Cedar Creeks. And here, on most good years, you're going to have some sort of hydrilla grass. And whenever you have a lake that has hydrilla grass in it, you're going to have a huge population of bass living around that grass. And the best time of the year to fish that stuff is from the middle of November through the end of March. And there are a ton of big bass actually that will get around a lot of these islands and things in this area and all over through here, as well as back in Rabbit and Cedar Creek and in Blakely Creek. And they'll be positioning in less than 5 foot of water around shallow vegetation. And you can burn a lipless crankbait like crazy. And I've caught them on Lake Ouachita in 50-degree water, burning a lipless crankbait over the top of grass mats that are like, the grass will be 2 or 3 feet under the surface over 10 foot of water, and you can catch 4, 5, and 6 pounders burning a lipless crankbait as fast as you can reel it over the grass in less than 2 foot of water, and they will come unglued on it, 4 and 5 and 6 pounders. It's crazy. And they're just around these islands with the grass and everywhere, and the biggest fish that you'll catch this time of year are going to be in 2 foot of water or less, 3 foot of water or less, all the way through January and February. You can find them sitting up in less than 10 foot of water on these points around these islands, things like that, with a lipless crankbait, as well as throwing like a Norman Deep little N, as well as a wigglewort. And this is how most tournaments get won on Ouachita, especially on cloudy, windy days. Now, question was on color. Gabe was asking about color. Just a red rattle trap, red striking red-eye shad, or a Excalibur 1 knocker. And one thing I found on this lake is the bigger the rattle trap or the bigger the red-eye shad you throw, the better. So a 3/4 ounce size, and just burn it as fast as you can, and they will engulf it. Now, that's not usually my style on Ouachita, though. I actually fish a different way, even though that's how all my buddies always catch them. But I've done really well in Ouachita, actually heading up into both Rabbit, Cedar Creek, and into Blakely Creek. And I fish very similar water to what I talked about on Hartwell and on Table Rock. And I'm actually going to pull up Google Earth here because I want to show you guys something pretty cool over on Ouachita. And we're just going to fly over here to Ouachita real quick because the grass is not easy to see, and you can't really see the contour lines very well on Navionics on Ouachita, but you can see them very easily on Google Earth if we go back in time. And one of my favorite areas in the entire lake is this little ditch right here. In early winter, so like just all of December basically, I've caught more 5+ pound bass out of this ditch right here than any other spot in the entire country. This just gets loaded up every winter, and it's an easy 15 to 25 pounds every single early winter. And what happens is that you have a ditch right here that comes into this area, and there's grass usually that's lining this ditch in, let's say, 3 to 15 feet of water. And I know I'm giving this up. I've given this up in other videos before, so I've already blown this area. I used to catch them here a lot like 5 years ago, but I don't fish in there anymore. And so what the fish will do is, if you look when the lake is up normal pool, all of this is underwater usually. But as the lake gets drawn down a little bit, you can kind of start to see where the ditch is, and you can kind of draw out here where that ditch comes in. And these fish will set up right on the edge of the grass when you have sunny, bright days and calm days. And also when you have cloudy days with no wind, they'll suspend kind of out in the middle of this ditch, and you can catch them throwing an Alabama rig and underspin the jerkbait in the center of this ditch. And then on some of the brighter sunny days, when it gets warmer, some of those fish will move on the outside edge of this grass, and you can catch them flipping a jig and throwing a football jig in the edge of the grass. And then on the windy days, they'll pull up actually onto this flat here, and you can burn that lipless crankbait and catch them up on top of the flat. And this is like a key winter area. This is like the ideal thing to look for. And there's several areas like this in Ouachita. I'm not going to give up any more, but this is one area I'm going to give up. And one thing you'll find is that sometimes you'll not have any grass on this lake, and it will be void of grass. But on the same area, there's still standing timber out here. And a lot of the standing timber is just a little bit off the grass line. And you can still catch fish out of that standing timber. I catch them on a football jig and an Alabama rig, and kind of working a swim bait through there sometimes if I get lucky and don't break off the bait. But usually a football jig and an Alabama rig in the timber a little bit deeper, and also in the center of this gut when that grass isn't there also produces, which is similar to what I talked about earlier on Table Rock and on Hartwell. But the area up here in Blakely Creek, as well as going over here into Rabbit and Cedar over here, same deal applies. If we take the lake back in time, there's a lot of these little grassy ditches and grassy drains that will hold fish. And some of them are just, your standard little point or a little pocket, and there's grass drains here. But some of them are kind of sneaky, like the ones I showed you earlier. I'm not going to show you any of my sneaky ones on this part of the lake because it's I can't give up all my stuff because buddies have shown me these spots. But one area I caught them on the video I can show you is right here off this point right here. And there's timber off this point and off here, and I've crushed them here. And so, again, I can't show you all the spots that I fish here because, again, buddies have shown them to me, and I can't do that to my buddies. But these are some areas I've caught them on right in through here. And if we pull this up on Navionics real quick, transition this over, you'll be able to see what that looks like kind of. It's really bad contour map on Washita, but there's kind of a channel that cuts in here, and there's timber all around in this area, and there's actually a ditch right here you can't see, and that's the areas I catch them on a lot. So little ditches, little drains leading into pockets, and the fish will get in the center of those drains on grass. And almost every tournament, if there's grass on the lake, every tournament's going to get one, either fishing grass ditches with a lipless crankbait or a jig, or they're going to be caught on Alabama where you got in the standing timber. Nowadays, that's just a way to catch them, unless you get a windy day and you can burn that lipless crankbait up shallow. So that's how tournaments get won in the winter on Washita and those grass lakes. And so for those of you who are in Washita, that was some pretty good advice, I think, there. It took me 10 years to learn all that stuff. And I was just messing with Randy, by the way, busting his chops on the Washita stuff.
That's interesting because back when I fished Washita all the time, there wasn't any grass in it. I mean, there was no hydrilla back then. And so, obviously they're going to be in the hydrilla when you have it. But one other option,
hey, Randy, could you pull up your Navionics just because I'm seeing myself double on your screen. Yeah. Just click on your Navionics there. There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One other thing that you might try early winter a lot of times, and I have caught them at Washita doing this, is if the lake happens to be abnormally high, there's a lot of flooded bushes in the back of those flatter creeks, and you can catch them out of those flooded bushes in the early winter. I've actually done really good fishing jerk baits around them if it's high enough. So there's a lot of different options, besides grass. Obviously, you're not going to compete with like the 5 and 6 pounders that you're talking about, but yeah, that's a lot of different options there.
Yeah, and that grass deal, that's just a thing you just have to know about and just learn from years of experience. That's a lot of times, guys, when I fished tournaments back in the day, a lot, and I say back in the day, I'm not that old, but like I fished over 125 tournaments by the time I was 18 years old. And on all those tournaments as co-anglers or fishing as a boater or fishing in like junior clubs, one thing I learned is I fish the same lakes over and over again. And while I can go out and catch fish with Randy in videos on these lakes in this area of the country, Table Rock Lake, Grand Lake, I'm not an expert on those lakes. I don't understand where the fish go in certain times of the year and what areas hold the bigger fish. But on a lake like Washita, I know it very well. I've fished it hundreds of times, and I know which sections of the lake hold the bigger fish and what patterns are productive. And so if you see guys in tournaments and stuff and they're kicking butt on a certain lake, it's usually because they know what section of the lake is on fire in each month based on certain conditions. Like I know when there's grass on Washita in Blakely, I know how to catch them. If there's not grass in Blakely at that time of year, I also know how to catch them. And I know how to do it in pretty much every other season of the year as well. So that's kind of the challenge when you go out to tournament fish, especially if you're just starting out, is that you don't necessarily know where all the good areas are, and unless you stumble on them in practice or your first few days of fishing, it's hard to beat the locals. And it's hard to beat the locals even in these opens, Randy, right? The guys that are just going to all these tournaments and jackpotting them.
Very difficult, yeah.
Awesome. Well, let's talk about Cumberland Lake then, Randy. That's the last one we're going to talk about, and it's going to be primarily a smallmouth fishery. Someone did ask about that earlier. While you have that pulled up, and I'm going to answer a couple questions here.
Yeah.
Got a question from Rudrook. I don't know how to pronounce that name, but do you run into and catch crappie in the same type of offshore structure as bass? Yes. If I wanted to fish for crappie, I catch a limited crappie every single day I go fishing, basically. I find so many crappie while graphing offshore. I just choose not to fish for them. I leave them for other people. I usually actually go and if I ever find a big group of crappie, if there's a crappie guy in the area, I'll be like, hey, come fish right here. I have put a lot of guys on crappie over the years because like I'll just be graphing around and I'll see them be like, hey, go over to this point over here. I'll like show them on their graph and mark it and say there's a giant brush pile with crappie in it. So I do that stuff all the time just because other people can enjoy them and I'm not going to fish for them. So good question there. But anyways, Randy, Lake Cumberland, deep, clear lake again, super steep, 4+ foot of visibility, and also smallmouth. So how do you fish differently on a smallmouth lake in the winter?
Oh man, I love Lake Cumberland. Lake Cumberland is one of my favorite lakes in the country because it's such a massive lake. I mean, if you've never been to it, it's absolutely huge, and fish is huge. It's not necessarily that it's that much more giant than a lot of the good sized lakes in the country, but there's so much fishable shoreline that, like on Lake Cumberland, like for example, you can see this little arm off a creek here. You could spend all day just right here. I mean, literally, there's so much good looking cover. The banks look good everywhere. That it just fishes great. Fish is really big. But when you're dealing with early winter smallmouth on a lake like Cumberland, and I'm going to say that Cumberland's got a diverse mix. It's got largemouth, spotted bass, and smallmouth. But obviously, on a lake like Cumberland and a lot of different lakes across the country, when you're dealing with largemouth, most of the largemouth are going to come in the backs of the little coves and the little feeder arms down here, or they're going to come well up the river. That's where you catch the majority of your largemouth. You very seldom on a smallmouth lake like Del Hollow, Cumberland, that type of stuff. You very seldom catch many good largemouth out on the main part of the lake. And the spotted bass are just sort of mixed in between. But the things that I want to look for in the early winter on a smallmouth lake is I'm on the lower end of the lake. I just think there's a bigger population of big smallmouth on the lower to maybe lower mid end of the lake for the most part. And I'm on the main body of the water. Most good smallmouth lakes that you have across the country, they've got a lot of they've got a combination of gravel and bluff. And that's what I'm looking for is I'll go down on the lower end of the lake here and I'm fishing all of these steep banks and steep points, on the main lake itself. And, every one of these, there's tons of like little, just main lake round. Some are more defined than others, but here's just a typical point on Cumberland. It's just main lake bank here, turning it into a rounded steep point. You got 50, 70 foot of water, a long cast away from the bank. And you've got a mixed rock variation here. A lot of these banks, like on Cumberland, you have a combination. They can be boulders, they can be chunk rock, they can be basketball sized rock, there can be gravel all mixed in here. And there's a lot of rock transitions. Like here, this may be a steep rock point transitioning more, excuse me, into chunk rock and gravel on the main part of the lake. And those smallmouth will hold on these rounded main points all through that part of the lake like this. Normally what I'll do is I'll roll up, I'll fish these points, I'll fish maybe 50 to 100 yards down both sides of them. And this is a typical one right here. These smallmouth on certain days are going to be setting shallow. They'll be in 5 to 10 foot of water. You can catch them cranking, you can catch them on a jig, that type of stuff. And then other times of the year, they're going to be out in this 20 to 30 foot of water further out and suspended and on the bottom both. They're going to be both suspended and on the bottom. One of the things you'll find out about smallmouth on a non-northern natural lake, on a man-made southern, and I'll call this southern, but northern smallmouth, I'm talking about Great Lakes, that type of stuff. But on a man-made smallmouth lake that is common in Tennessee and Kentucky, you don't have the smallmouth suspended out on these steep banks and points like you do up north. Now they will suspend. You can catch them suspended out there, but a lot of times these smallmouth, they'll get on the bottom like in 5 to 30 foot of water, and they like the steep stuff out here. These steep banks. Just these steep rounded points like this. And that's what I'm looking for is I stay on the steep stuff, stay on the main lake, and I'm staying on the lower end of the lake like this. So if I was fishing Cumberland right now, early winter, I would make this my main lake. I wouldn't go back in the creek arms much at all. The creek arms I'd use more like in the pre-spawn, different times of the year. Although you can catch them in here, I'm not saying you couldn't. You could. There's a lot of stuff in here. If you go to these creek arms, there's the same type of secondary points, but I don't catch the numbers or the size that I would out on the main lake here. So uh, even though I'm fishing points out off the bank, I'm still fishing. I still consider it shallow because it's bank oriented. All these places I'm talking about here, I can easily hit the bank with the cast.
Awesome, good stuff. And some of the guys are actually from Cumberland. They're wondering why the west side of the lake seems to be a better producer than up on the east side, kind of like by Fishing Creek, where you guys normally launch when you do your like Burnside Marina, where you do the boat launch for the FW tour. Why is it that most of those good fish are down south? I have my theory, but what are your
Well,
thoughts?
it's a lot different. I mean, okay, for example, the Burnside area up here, not you got your water clarity up here is still clean, but it's not clear compared to down the lake. So you got, probably twice the water visibility clarity down in this part of the lake. And also in this area up here, it's just laid out different. You have more flatter banks. You've got a lot of 45-degree angle banks. The lake's narrower a little bit. You don't have the major feeder creeks coming in like you do on the lower end of the lake, but mainly the habitat's different. This area of the lake right through here, this is massive. I'm talking when I'm circling right here, this is something that you couldn't possibly fish in a week's time. It's huge. And as you can see here, it's a little bit wider. You got a diverse mix of like, coves off the main lake. You got bluff banks. You got, flats. You got lots of creeks coming in here. There's just a lot of diversity in this part of the lake. So for me, I've had good tournaments on Cumberland before. This is just the area of the lake that I like to fish right here.
Good stuff. Well, from an offshore perspective, the challenge of fishing a lake like Cumberland is that there's not a lot of flat banks. Most of the lake is very, very steep. And while the banks, some of them might stick out, they drop pretty quickly into deep water. I would say within a cast length from the bank, you're going to be in 100 foot of water on a lot of banks, even way back in the creeks. And whenever I'm trying to catch fish offshore, I usually like to have some flatter water close by that those fish can use to relate to. So my number one priority when I go to a lake like a Cumberland, if I'm trying to fish offshore, is I need to find some flatter water areas where you have 30 to 40 feet of water more than the cast length away from the bank. So like in this area here, we have some areas where you have 30 to 40 feet of water that is maybe 50 to 60 yards off the bank. That's the first key to find those offshore fish, because otherwise they're just going to feed up on the bank and you can just catch them with a jerk bait and a swim bait and a jig up shallow. So the shallow water fishing is going to be the primary player, and by shallow water, it might not mean you're fishing in shallow water. It means that your boat is within a cast length of the bank. You still might be fishing your bait in 25 to 30 feet of water, but because the banks are so steep, you're not going to be far off the bank. But if you do want to fish offshore, the first priority is finding those areas where you have some actual offshore access. And then usually what I'll do is I'll find an area, for example, like this, and try to locate areas, again, where the bait fish are setting up. Now, I want to find bait fish in the center of these guts, in the center of these pockets, just like I've talked about before on all the other Clearwater lakes. And I'm going to be graphing a ton for these bait fish. And a lot of these smallmouth will set up in the mouths of these pockets and guts, and they'll actually set up on the bottom or near the bottom in 25 to 50 foot of water, somewhere in there. And they'll be right on the center of those guts, between islands, between little points and stuff, where you have that flatter water sticking out. And the number one way I catch them is on a Demiki rig. If I'm ever fishing for smallmouth specifically, I need to be throwing a Demiki rig. I'm fishing it vertically for those fish. A Demiki rig is basically this little Demiki armor shad. It's a 2.5 to 3 inch little swim bait. I'm putting it on a Demiki rig head, which is basically a vertical line tie jig head with a little bit of weight balance underneath to keel that bait so it sits perfectly horizontal in the water column. And I like to use anywhere from a 3/8 to a 1/2 ounce head because I'm going to be fishing vertically for these fish. I'm basically dropping it straight down below the boat, sitting it in front of those fish, and just shaking it. And actually, I don't shake it. That's a thing I don't do. I was about to say that. Basically, you just drop the Demiki rig down there, and you don't move it. You just sit it in front of their face. And that little tail on that swim bait quivers with even the smallest action, and movement of your boat, the movement of your hand just shaking naturally, your natural movement will put enough motion in this bait, and you basically just dead stick that bait in front of those fish's face that you see on your live scope or in the past on 2D sonar, and you just drop that bait in front of them and just hold it there dead still. And then every once in a while you'll see a little squiggly spaghetti line on your graph or a fish on live scope come up and eat your bait, and that's the key. Now, one question I did get earlier from Artie is, when you're fishing in a lot of these areas, you might have a situation where you have a pile of bait fish. Maybe there's like a football field size worth of bait fish. And a lot of times that's good because it will hold a lot of bass, but it's also hard to differentiate your bait from the living bait fish. And the key to getting fish to bite when there's a ton of bait fish around is that you need to get your bait in front of their face while they're actually feeding. And the way you can do that when you're fishing around in the summer a lot of times is if you see schooling fish, they're schooling on big balls of shad. Those fish will be out here schooling, and if you can get a topwater in front of those fish within 5 seconds after they blow up, you can get those fish to eat your topwater. Well, when you're fishing offshore, it's the exact same thing. The way you have to get those fish to bite is you need to get a bait in front of a feeding fish's face within 5 to 10 seconds of you seeing them on your fish finder. So what you'll find a lot of times, you'll see arches or squiggly lines underneath a ball of bait fish, and they're usually hurting those bait fish. And I'll make videos about this. I'm not showing graphics right now of this, and I'm going to be making videos with all this, showing this on my fish finder and all those things, so don't worry. And basically what's happening is that these fish are going to be hurting these bait fish super deep. I'm going to be dropping that Demiki rig down to them, or a jigging spoon, or an ice fishing jig, or whatever it is, and I want to get that bait between the shad and the bass. And it's literally like putting that bait on their nose. And now some guys are going to be like, well, that's cheating, that's not the way you need to do it, but that's the way you have to do it if you have a ton of bait fish around. Otherwise, you just need to go to an area that doesn't have as many bait fish. Just go to an area with limited to no bait fish, just a few bait fish balls or whatever. Those are going to be the easier fish to catch because you can differentiate your bait from the bait fish. So that is that right there. That's all the stuff we have on these 4 lakes, Randy. Anything else to add on what I just talked about?
Yeah, just like I would want to reiterate, as far as, like I said, every lake is unique to itself, and there's, there are some common threads on what we talked about that you can apply to different lakes, but a lot of the things about early winter fishing, you got to really pay close attention to the time that you're there, as far as the water level in relationship to what it normally is, based upon weather patterns that have came in before or what's coming up, the specific day as far as the wind, the amount of sunlight penetration the water's getting, if the water clarities are normal or if they're abnormal, all this has a big impact on the shallow fish as far as where you need to fish and how you need to fish. But for the most part, I would suggest try fishing this time of year, early winter, like in the same type of areas you fish during the pre-spawn. Those are the same type of areas that's going to be good right now, and you just sort of have to adjust your techniques a little bit.
Good stuff. For those offshore fish on the Clearwater Lakes, just graph for bait fish. That's all you have to do. That's the key. So before you guys all jump off the stream, one thing I want to share with you guys again is some of the stuff from fishthemoment.com. One thing we have that we've been working on really hard are Fish the Moment lake breakdowns. We've completely revamped them, and we're offering 40 GPS waypoints on lakes all across the country with detailed area descriptions as well as summaries of the lake. And you can actually download these onto your fish finder, your Lowrance unit, your Garmin unit, your Humminbird unit, and you can view these waypoints on your fish finder, which is super cool. All these spots are picked out by Randy. He spends a ton of time putting them together, and we have breakdowns for a bunch of lakes in the fall, as well as a lot of winter breakdowns that we're trying to get as fast as we can. And one actually just popped up while we're doing the stream, Randy. That was pretty good stuff right there. You are just knocking them out like crazy. So these winter breakdowns are really great way to dial in spots you need to be looking for, especially if you're struggling to catch fish on your home lake. And we're also going to be offering the personalized lake breakdowns again once Randy finishes up with the opens. Another thing to pay attention to or to check out are our upcoming virtual seminars. We have an offshore winter seminar, so focus on offshore bass fishing. And I get into a lot of stuff I talked about in this video that I didn't explain with graphics and in detail. I'll be showing exact spots to go focus on catching fish, what to look for on your fish finder, the key baits, how to get the bait between the bait fish and the bass like I talked about earlier. All that stuff's going to be talked about in this seminar, and you're going to be able to get a lot of great info out of this. And then also a winter crankbait seminar that Randy and I are going to be doing about how to catch fish on a crankbait throughout the entire winter, even when water temperatures are as low as 40 degrees. We both love throwing crankbaits in the winter. It's one of the best ways to catch them, especially catching big bass. So definitely check out these seminars if you're interested in, especially if you're a tournament angler. Both these seminars are a must. If you fish any winter tournament trails, you could literally just take the stuff you learned in this offshore seminar and the crankbait seminar and dominate on your local tours between the two different styles. So definitely recommend that. And then we also have a recording of the advanced electronics seminar I've given 4 times now, and we filled up all the spots, so over 120 guys have taken this webinar, and people have really enjoyed it. It's got a lot of good response. It's the best seminar webinar, I believe, on bass fishing, period, out there for sale. If you guys really want to learn your electronics, learn about offshore bass fishing behavior, and how to take what you see in your fish finder and turn it into more fish catches, this is the seminar for you. Definitely check it out, fishthemoment.com. This is the place to go, and it's an amazing seminar. Guys in the chat probably can attest to that and in the comments. And then finally, we have a winter sale going on, a Christmas sale going on all of our merchandise. And so if you guys want to check out some nice hats, shirts, especially our sun shirts and our winter or our sun buffs, these are really high quality products we put out. We still have a bunch of them left from the summer. So this is the best price you're ever going to find on a super high quality sun shirt and a buff like this. So definitely check them out if you guys want to pick these up on sale, 25% off. We also offer gift cards if you want to have maybe significant other or someone pick you out a gift card so you can purchase some of the things I just showed you. So that's it, guys, from the website. And that's it for the stream. Randy, anything else you wanted to talk about before we close up for the night?
Yeah, just thanks a lot, everybody, for tuning in. We know that everybody that tunes into the podcast, they're pretty much hardcore Fish the Moment fans, and we definitely appreciate that. We appreciate the passion and the following, and that's what allows us to do this. And you guys subscribing to the channel, watching the videos, doing part of this. That's how we're able to bring you this information. So we don't take it for granted and appreciate everything on that. We really do.
For sure. Really appreciate all the support, guys. And we got some cool stuff coming up on Fish at the Moment. You've seen some new graphics I've been putting in videos. I'm kind of experimenting with some stuff, but there's going to be some crazy stuff. I just got a camera drone, and we're going to be doing an awesome complete guide to dock fishing where I put a drone up in the air and showed you how I fish around a dock. It's going to be awesome. Really cool content coming, free to Fish at the Moment YouTube channel. So if you did enjoy this seminar, I would highly recommend subscribing to the Fish the Moment YouTube channel to get notifications on all of our upcoming videos and learn a lot of great fishing info from both myself and Randy. So definitely check out the Fish the Moment YouTube page and check out fishthemoment.com. And other than that, we'll see you guys. Actually, I'll see you next week for another live stream. Randy's going to be fishing the Bassmaster Open, but I'll be here and we'll be talking about something interesting, and we'll be putting that out next week. So anyways, thanks guys for checking out the stream. We'll see y'all next week.